Hey, Boss Hole Transformation Nation. How you doing? This is John Brewer, your co-host. I'm sitting here with Sarah Best, my co-host, an amazing person. Sarah, subject matter expert episode today. Who are we talking to?
Hey, John. Good to see you. We are talking to Dr. Stephen Tang. And if I just may, thought leader, also known as a Renaissance man, by the way, from William and Mary Alumni Magazine. In 2022, as a graduate of Lehigh University, he received a prestigious award for his work, which I'm going to describe to you now. He's former president and CEO, also chairman of the board for OraSure Technologies, which is a publicly traded organization that has crafted and engineered a COVID test, a very popular, very simple COVID test. And they experienced, just like all of us did, the pandemic, but radical growth through that. He's recently become an author. He's written a book called A Test for Our Time, Crisis Leadership for the Next Normal. His tenure as a leader goes back a long way. He's also been a management consultant, but I think our listeners are going to be surprised. He's a scientist. They're going to be surprised about the angle that he talks about and takes when it comes to leadership.
No doubt. It's a great discussion. And you want to get to it?
Let's do it.
All right. The Boss Hole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode.
Dr. Tang, Steve, as you like to be called, it is so great to have you with us on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, John. Great to be with you.
Yeah, and we have to acknowledge that today is a very special day. 3/23/23. It is the day of the publishing of your book. So you are CEO, founder, owner, chairman, civic leader turned author officially today. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I will never forget this day and being with the both of you. So thanks for having me on.
Well, we're honored.
Right.
We're honored to be part of the launch of the book. And by the way, just remember, everybody, go to the show notes. There will be a link to the book, and the book is entitled "A Test for Our Time: Crisis Leadership in the Next Normal." And we're really going to dig into that with Steve. And to that point, Steve, I know you call this out in the book. Why don't we go back a little bit to the origin story of your days with OraSure and take us through that journey, because that provided a lot of grist for the mill, if you will, for the book, did it not?
Yes, it did. My journey and the many intersections in my career with OraSure Technology are a story in its own right. I went to graduate school at Lehigh University back in 1982, and OraSure was founded as a spin-out of Lehigh University in the late 80s. And so I knew the founders. I knew about the company. I even reviewed some of their funding proposals for the state of Pennsylvania along the way. And little did I know that my career journey over some 40 years would end up 0.7 miles away from where I started at this one-bedroom apartment that I was renting as a graduate student to the world headquarters of OraSure Technologies. And so it's uncommon in many ways, and it's romantic in certain ways as well. So I will admit to that, and I would admit to a flirtation over many years before I actually became chairman, then CEO of the company. But OraSure is an interesting company because it's faced pandemics before. It created diagnostics for some terrible diseases like Ebola, HIV, hepatitis C. And so it had some background before the COVID-19 pandemic even started. But we really amped that up during the pandemic. And the story, Test for Our Time, is in large part about how the company overcame many obstacles, not the least of which was the safety and well-being of our employees, to develop an at-home COVID test, but not just any at-home COVID test. It's the one that Oprah Winfrey and Company calls the easiest test to use of its kind on the market today.
Nice.
And in doing so, increased the revenue of the company from about $150 million in 2019 to this year, it'll be over $400 million. in sales. And this little town of Bethlehem, which is very Midwest in very many ways, different from Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, with earnest, hardworking people who come from a steel tradition, Bethlehem Steel, just a real joy to work with and steer them through the pandemic in some unexpected ways. So that's the story of me and OraSure and where OraSure ended up. I ended up leaving the company around this time last year, actually.
Okay.
It's always pleasing to see that something that you invested so much time and effort sustain itself and reach new heights, and that's what I'm proud of in developing it at OraSure and leaving for those that now lead it.
Well, and leaving it in a good place. I mean, that's what every leader would hope, that if I'm moving on, whatever the circumstances, that I am leaving people better for my being there, hopefully, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I think it's you're leaving the conditions for growth. That's what hopefully was done and will continue to be done at the company.
I'm truly interested, Steve, in helping our listeners more deeply understand what is your leadership style, what you believe, and certainly what you talk about, and what made OraSure and that experience there so successful. It's leading people wholeheartedly, mind, body, spirit. Let's start there. Let's talk about leadership, wholehearted leadership. What's your take on that?
Well, this has been an evolving, I think, curriculum for me over many years. And I first and foremost believe that leaders should be students of their craft and their profession, right? Yes. It's not about the authority or political power or social status of the position. It's really trying to do your job as best as possible and learning as much as possible to use over time. And I think as everybody experienced in leadership roles, once the pandemic hit, all bets were off. None of us knew what to do during a pandemic. And if you weren't or didn't consider yourself an entrepreneur to begin with, you were an entrepreneur from that moment on, because we were making stuff up as we went along, I think, for sure. But part of my experience, I think, leading up to the pandemic was I saw in this company great potential, but I also saw some very unhealthy habits. I mean, there were some senior executives that went through some serious illnesses, and I went through my own bout of serious illnesses over time. I was a very hard charger in my younger days, didn't know from work-life balance, and I think that took its toll on my body and in my relationships. And so I saw, as I came aboard the CEO role at OraSure back in 2018, a chance to make a difference in people's lives. Certainly, we were doing that from a healthcare perspective and creating circumstances where people could learn more about their health for better diagnostics and testing. But we need to do more than that. We need to be healthy. We need to bring our best selves to what we were doing every single day. Unfortunately, we began to put that in place before the pandemic started, and then the pandemic just amped it up completely. I mean, we made sure that we took care of ourselves. I made sure that I didn't tell anybody anything that I didn't know, and I became very comfortable telling them about what I didn't know. And a lot of the early days of the pandemic, we didn't know anything. So we erred on the side of caution to keep people safe, whether they're at home or coming to the factory or lab. And fortunately, we had very few incidences of COVID-19 that originated in the workplace. So it was more than just the workplace, obviously, at stake. It was people's homes. It was people's neighborhoods. It's if we look back over 3 years, those were difficult times when we began in March of 2020.
Right.
That's a long, winding way to say that I come to my education in leading from the mind, the body, and the spirit from personal experience. And I think it really all came together during the pandemic because it was emotionally charged. We had to reduce the fear people had in their own circumstances. But then once we had this opportunity to create what became the product IntelliSwab, the world's easiest test to use of its kind for COVID-19. We had to get people at a productivity level that they've never seen before in their lives, let alone at OraSure. And so you had that great dichotomy of removing fear and increasing enthusiasm in order to address both the threat and the opportunity of what was in front of us. So, it wasn't like we were first responders, with all due respect to paramedics and firemen and police officers, but it sure felt like we were running into the emergency and getting down to work.
Yeah,
so
you were.
That's
You
when we started.
I'm sorry, you wouldn't have been far behind the tip of the spear. That's for sure, because the demand that people had for diagnostics and testing, I can only imagine the fervor that you experienced with that.
Those were heady days. I actually just finished a book. I think the author's name is Liz Hoffman. The book is called Crash Landing, which she characterizes what it was like for big business. So the big car companies, the big airlines, big hotel chains, and it was an interesting read for me because, we were a very small company. And so we didn't have the benefit of access to the White House and decision makers or anything like that. So we had to play a very different game to get where we were. But you're right. The need for testing was profound from the get-go. It's still very high today.
Sure.
And we couldn't do things fast enough. But yet we had to. We had to move with speed, but not haste.
I have a question about that. I get free insurance or free tests from my insurance. Before that, you could go to the corner store and buy them. But even before that, like now they're available and everybody can have access to them. Is that funded primarily through the government? Are insurance companies buying those and distributing those? How's that working?
It has been mostly government funded.
Okay.
And that makes sense because if you think about, we have 300 going on 400 million Americans.
Yes.
Nobody's just going to be tested once during the entire year, right?
Right.
Tested whenever you think you've been exposed. And so the sheer number of tests that need to be produced is massive. And, that's an area where, as economists say, when there's a market failing, the government has to step in. And I think that's what happened with testing.
Yeah.
But now that the emergency has been called off by the federal government, we're going to see different channels and avenues. But I hear more reports of IntelliSwab being used in schools by school-age children than any other test. And it makes sense because it's so easy to use. So I think there'll always be a sustaining market for testing folks to make sure it's not COVID. Now, we've got to think from a healthcare perspective, look at the bigger picture, which is we only not want to, we want to be free of COVID, but we also want to be free of the seasonal flu.
Yes.
And RSV, which is just a terrible disease for young children. So we're going to have to figure all these things out over time as we get ourselves, as we say, into the next normal.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Steve, one of the things that, as we continue to talk about your leadership style that you shared with us, leading whole people wholeheartedly was part of it, as Sarah said, but you also talk about engage them emotionally. Speak more about that, would you? I mean, it's the old management model. You probably never heard that. And today we're talking about engagement, compassion, connecting with people on a different level. And tell us more about the emotional connection.
When I was a management consultant back in the 1990s, I worked for a company called Gemini Consulting, which had a trust formula. And this is, I think, the heart of wholehearted leadership. The trust formula says that there are two major components. One is credibility and one is intimacy. Credibility, very simply, is you do what you say you're going to do. So credibility is doing what you say you're doing. Intimacy means I know you have my back. And that's the essence, I think, of developing trust with people. Now, if you consider that when you're in a risky situation, which the pandemic certainly was, and you're in a risky situation where you're developing a product that nobody's ever developed before, the only way to get trust high is to make sure you're maximizing credibility and maximizing intimacy. So the emotional side of that is the intimacy side. Okay. If you hire the right people who do what they say they're going to do, and they're amping it up by doing what they said they were going to do, even though what they said they've never done before, right? Then you've got a situation where you're managing trust effectively, right?
Yep.
Credibility and intimacy. And intimacy was a big part of this because we were all threatened by the coronavirus. Our well-being, our existence was threatened by the virus. So job one for any CEO and leader, I think, was making sure that everyone knew that safety and well-being was the primary reason for existing.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that varied with that was not going to be acceptable. And it was constantly messaging that. The heart of the book that I just wrote, Test for Our Time, were the correspondences with my employees over 2 years' time.
Okay.
These were written letters to them every Monday called Monday Motivational Messages. It became a dialogue between me and the employees over 2 years' time, over 100 letters. So the written word was powerful, and it had to be powerful because I couldn't see them, the things that we relied on, looking people in the eye, shaking their hand, hugging them, is not available. In fact, it would have been a health hazard to try to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reach people with sincerity? And I think the written word became very powerful.
Beyond that, to your point of integrity, not only the written word or spoken word, but being able to live that out, authentically, which is, people will see right through that if they see that your actions are not consistent with those words or spoken or written.
That's for sure. And it's the old saying, we're all in the same storm together, but we were in different boats.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the CEO's boat was not a luxury yacht by any means.
That's right.
I mean, I'm sitting in my dining room right here, and I will imagine that many of my employees were working out of spaces the same size or smaller,
right,
homes. And so we were all in this together. We were all desperately trying to make sense of it all,
right.
which is what the leader has to help people do as well. And certainly part of that making sense was more than just the logic of it. It was the emotional ties to it. It was the spiritual ties to it.
Sure.
And so all those elements, I think, were within the grasp of leaders and CEOs. Whether they use them or not, I think is yet another thing. But what I found is you had to use all three dimensions. You had to engage mind, body, and spirit to really persuade people to do things that they hadn't done before.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go with that, if you don't mind, one of the things I remember, Sarah and I, at the beginning of the pandemic, spent an awful lot of time virtually working with leadership groups around resilience. That was, how do we right the ship, or how do we even understand how to navigate considering all of this chaos and everything going on? And one of the things that we realized, and this is pretty evident, is that if the pandemic did anything, it exposed a huge vulnerability we had in our leadership ranks, that our managers and supervisors, I mean, who was equipped for that? Virtually no one, as you said before. But I mean, let's face it, if we're not prepared now, if that doesn't serve as a powerful lesson moving forward, shame on us. And that's been our work to reinvent the role of the manager, keep managers out of the boss hole zone. So what do you see with all that? What do you see going forward with things that are happening in the world now?
Yeah, I think it's redefined what crisis leadership is all about, John. I mean, crisis leadership used to be about the manual that nobody wanted to pull from the shelf, because there was some natural disaster or some sort of tragedy that a company had to overcome. I mean, over the past few weeks at the border of Ohio and Pennsylvania, we had that deadly train crash.
Mm-hmm.
And, apparently the manual wasn't put to good use there, right?
Right.
So time and time again, even situations like that, I think we look back on and say it could have been better, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think in terms of engineering resilience into what we do, I think we need to consider the fact that crisis leadership will be everyday leadership going forward.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because we're never quite sure what's going to reset us day to day in terms of dealing with people and circumstances. And so it makes sense that we lean on the people management, the human management side of that, not the things, the offices, the machines, because as we learned during the pandemic, the people are the most important asset. So I think that we need to move from a mindset of, crises are about, serving and responding to leading and challenging, that kind of mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that concepts I became very fond of during the pandemic was this notion of anti-fragile, right? So anti-fragile is better than resilient, because anti-fragile means that as things get worse, you actually get better. So picture something like exercise. How does exercise work? It's because you beat up your bones and your muscles and they grow stronger.
Right.
So I think if we change the paradigm there and think about crisis leadership as an opportunity to become anti-fragile, we'll take a very different mindset towards our people and how we treat them and how we want to advance them during a crisis.
And we will be right back.
With employee disengagement at its highest level in 9 years, your company can't afford to miss the mark when it comes to optimizing your hiring, management, and team performance practices. At its lowest level, employee turnover costs you $11,000 per person. And those are dollars you can easily save with the right set of people analytics. Real Good Ventures is a talent optimization consultancy specializing in world-class analytics specific to your people and the critical role they play within your organization. Gain confidence in your hiring practices, keep the boss holes from driving your talent away, design your teams for flawless execution, and create a culture that offers meaning and fulfillment. Real Good Ventures has a family of validated diagnostic tools specific to the human aspect of business, because we know that all business issues are people issues. Visit us today at www.realgoodventures.com and bring meaning and fulfillment back into your workplace.
Okay, let's get back to the program.
Well, and you mentioned before we hit record today, the term polycrisis. Talk on that for a minute, because I do think it is the new normal. That's what you were kind of discussing with us. Share your take on that.
Yeah, in the book, I go to great lengths to distinguish between the old normal, which was pre-pandemic, the new normal, which is what we're in right now, trying to cope with the pandemic and making sure that we're all staying well and safe, but still not sure where the bottom is, right? The next normal, I think, will be filled with crises that we can't imagine. And we're getting a taste of that today, right? The banking crisis, which seemed like it came out of nowhere and that has been tagging along and affected what the Fed's doing. So here's an idea, here's a situation where you have little tiny drops into the pond with little waves being generated that magnify the waves from another drop in the pond. And sooner or later, you have large waves and tsunamis that develop for somebody to manage. Yeah. And I think that will be what the next normal is all about, is that leaders need to prepare that that's going to be the normal. The crises are the normal, not something to be avoided or wait out. And we've got to find opportunities to deal with those situations and overcome them better than we thought before. So I don't think there's any going back to the old normal. And so we talk about work practices in the workplaces and why don't we just go back to the old normal? I don't think there is any old normal to what we're doing anymore. So that doesn't make any sense.
Well, and there's two parts to that. I was thinking, as you were describing the kind of leadership that's really essential and required now in the new normal, it's always been the leadership that's been required and would have been helpful, but maybe the stakes weren't as high as they are now because of the polycrises and this new normal. In other words, being wholehearted and being a wholehearted leader, building cultures of belonging and trust and coherence in your organization, we have to do that now. That's the first part, is this isn't a new idea. We were failing at it before. We cannot fail at it now. The second idea is being intentional. But we were also talking before you hit record about, the hybrid nature of things and how we're talking a lot about it, even writing scholarly articles, but there's not a lot of intentionality being directed toward mastering this hybrid environment. What say you on that subject?
Well, we all stumbled into this remote work, hybrid work environment. It wasn't as if, a master consultant came up with the idea and said, do this. This will serve you well, right? And yet we haven't, as you said, Sarah, been intentional about it. We haven't stepped back and said, what does this actually mean to us? All right. So the first stake in the ground I'll put for intentionality is my focus on whole people, leading whole people wholeheartedly. And that's the simple recognition as a leader that the people that work for you are whole people. They're not just employees. They're not just people doing tasks for you. They are people with full lives and livelihoods, and they are yours to lead.
Yes.
So this somehow notion we had way back when in the old normal that, well, you're mine from 9 to 5, and then you can do whatever you want to. I mean, that just doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
People have integrated their lives successfully and called questions about their work-life balance and the interruptions of work and where does that fit in. And I don't think we're going back. And so I think that needs to be accounted for in the way that we are intentional about the workplace going forward. So if you think about what it takes to be an effective leader, let's say in a remote work or a hybrid work environment, that's not something that anybody went to school for.
Right.
Okay. And it's not anything, quite frankly, that we assess particularly well with our current measures of personality assessments or work style assessments. So, notice goes out to everybody involved with the hiring process, with assessing talent, with assessing leadership skills and assessing effectiveness that needs to go into this. And I think we're a little behind in that game of determining what that is. I think we've just been assuming that we've been doing it well without really characterizing the skills needed to get us there.
Right.
So I'll just contrast it. It's going to be more than making sure people are doing their work. Okay, because nobody needs a person standing figuratively behind them, saying, "Are you doing your work?" Right? You just can't manage like that. The way we manage meetings, which I think are there are too many meetings for too many people involving too much expense, going down the drain at the same time. What is the purpose of a meeting? Why can't a meeting be held over a Slack channel? Why do we really need, in all cases, synchronous communication versus asynchronous communication? Meaning, I'll email you or I'll Slack channel you or I'll send you a chat and you answer it whenever you answer it. Why gather all people at the same time and having them, be at the boss's behest for an hour or however long it lasts?
Right.
I think what we've discovered is that just extends the workday, because while they're in that meeting, they're not doing their work, or they got the camera off trying to do their work while listening to what's going on in the meeting, right?
Right.
So we've done this to ourselves by being unintentional about how the workday is being used and what portions of the hours are devoted towards what particular task. So I think it's high time that we, addressed all these things, because quite frankly, if we do it right, and I'll put the positive spin on it, then we can devote more towards professional and career growth.
Yeah.
Which we've seemingly never been able to do, even back in the old normal.
Yeah.
I have a good example of that, if I might share. I think it would be helpful for the listeners. I spent the last couple of days working off site with a leadership team who arrived at the conclusion, they've never really been a leadership team. So this is a company that was founded 20 some years ago. And the founder recognized a need to create cohesion and collaborative leadership at the top, instead of having heads of departments and having one-on-ones and individual direction provided to each department. He sees the need now, because of incredible growth, to align a leadership team and to have some strategy and, build trust and cohesion at that level. So of course, the issue or the means by which you do that are the meetings, and something akin to a daily huddle or a daily check-in. I think for a team like this, that's just really creating those relationships and creating the, the cadence of their meetings, et cetera. They didn't know anything different, but they landed on the idea that, we don't necessarily need to stand up or huddle or gather, but we do need a means by which to capture one-offs. Hey, I usually stop by your door after this meeting and tell you what the concern is that I have about so-and-so, whatever that may be, but it's bringing it to a medium or a channel. And I think that oftentimes we forget that technology or that support is available, or that means is something we haven't tried before. But I really think this is going to work well for that group, that they will all at the same time in the morning, maybe huddle up by Slack and just answer questions, but they'll stay tuned to that. I mean, we're not telling our listeners things they don't already know, but I think this is a great example of a fast-paced, very entrepreneurial team. They're growing, but they recognize unless and until we create that cadence and that dialogue, we're not going to get in sync. We're not going to have the trust that we need.
Well, that's right. I mean, the culture of empowerment and accountability starts at the top.
Yes.
Right? And somehow we need to build in ways of recruitment so that we better trust that we are hiring the right people for that model. And Sarah, something you said resonates completely with me, which is if the goal of a CEO or the top leader is to create better, faster decisions within their team, then that's got to be designed into the process.
Yes.
And if you can't trust people to be accountable, and you can't empower them to be accountable, my basic question is, why are they working for you, and why did you hire them?
Right.
That's right.
So it's more about hiring the right people and unleashing them into an environment of accountability and empowerment, and also offering them compassion and empathy for what I said before, being whole people. So these are not old concepts by any means.
No.
I think they've just been brought to the forefront by the last 3 years of dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah. I think of we had somebody, gosh, Sarah, I don't remember who it was, talking about referencing putting new wine into old wineskins, and you just like, who was that?
I don't remember.
It's a great analogy. I mean, this is the old command and control, and I don't know, Steve, I can cut this out if you know who Aaron Dignan is, Brave New Work.
Yes.
Okay. And our listeners will remember Aaron Dignan, Brave New Work. And actually, when it comes to something they created called Murmur, which is a new progressive way of creating decision rights within an organization that is asynchronous, but it breaks the common old framework of we got to have meetings. It's like this new wine has to be supported by new types of managers. And that's, I think, when you talk about getting the right talent, if organizations do nothing else, being so intentional about managers and supervisors, or we call them people developers, or as Heather Haas would call them, people first managers. That's the change that's necessary, and it's happening way too slow. Disengagement statistics from Gallup would suggest that it should go a lot faster. But sorry, I just love the idea of the mind, body, spirit, the wholehearted approach, and it is all consistent with everything we're hearing about a new way of leading and a new type of manager that's needed.
I agree, John. I think the language that we use is going to be part of what gets us there, right?
Yeah, true.
And so I think we spend too much time talking about leaders and managers creating safety. I think the target ought to be to create brave people, not just safe people, right?
Yeah, right.
Bravery relies on being courageous. Courageous comes from the heart, so it all comes together.
It does.
So it's being able to have the humility to hire people that do things better than you do in those areas. I think which will get us all to a braver place as teams. But we can't assume. I think, Sarah, the example you gave, the team you work with, the first step is to realize that you aren't there. That something's got to change, right?
Yes.
And I don't think enough teams have done that as yet. We just assume that we've been doing this well together, even though we probably have not been.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and as you talk about brave leaders, I'm reminded of Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. I know you're a big fan of her work, and your book is really kind of an application of her concepts. Wholeheartedness, leading whole people with wholeheartedness. You also incorporate ideas of Adam Grant's Think Again, Susan Cain's Bittersweet. These are such provocative thought leaders and tool providers for leaders. And yet you found a way in your book to kind of distill down to some simple approaches, I think, that any leader could adopt. I would argue that, yes, we absolutely need them now, because if the new normal is polycrisis, and we certainly don't want to, we're not here to create panic or shock or scare our listeners, but to recognize, hey, we've got to level up a little bit and become better equipped and to do it together. So I love a few other ideas, journeying into and out of the darkness together. That's part of what you talk about in your book. Aspiring, risk-taking, learning, and achieving. And I think that's the last thing I'll comment on is we have to be more comfortable with risk-taking. Many of us are not wired that way, but it is risk-taking that provides innovation. And it's innovation, like, for example, at OraSure, that got us to a place of everybody can have 8 tests in their cupboard anytime they want. And you can have tests in school for the COVID-19 and all the other amazing things OraSure has done. But it's that risk-taking, and it's the trying that gets us there. And we have to have psychological safety for that. We have to have environments where people could say, yeah, I could be totally off base on this, but I've been given the go ahead because I'm empowered and they trust me. And if it doesn't work, we'll figure it out. That's what we need. And there's so much more, but I'm really excited to share, that not only the link to your book, but there's many other resources we have that you've generated. Some of your blogs, there's a couple of YouTube videos that we have access to now. We're going to put all of that, Steve, in the show notes for our listeners.
Well, I appreciate it, Sarah. I think all of the management gurus have something to say about this, but not everybody has everything to say about it. So I think that sampling across the spectrum of different perspectives, to me as a scientist, makes sense, because you got to be willing to experiment in leadership, just as you experiment in the laboratory to create new innovative products. And I think that's the mandate for every leader, is to be comfortable with the experimentation and to do it intentionally as well. I'm coming back to intention, but part of the contrast that I would try to draw in communicating with the people of OraSure is the contrast between toxic positivity and tragic optimism. And so toxic positivity means, don't worry, it'll all be fine, which we all knew was not the case. Right. And so there's something very inauthentic about being toxically positive.
Right.
Amen.
Right. Yeah. The leaders to talk from toxic positivity, they do so at their own detriment. But I became very fond of tragic optimism, because I saw that a lot of the world was pretty tragic.
Yeah.
The death and destruction from the pandemic, the social political polarization, the geopolitical strife. Now we've got wars. All of it was just pretty horrible. And yet, if we can do what we do well to have an impact on the world, what I found is that helps people rally towards a cause they can believe in.
For sure.
I think there'll be more of those opportunities, to look at situations where threats and opportunities come together, where companies and leaders can make difference if they can manage their teams and their people well.
Right.
But it all comes down to, I think leaders and managers have to extend the hand. It's up to us. I mean, Sarah, you talked about before the huddle or chasing down people after meetings. The leader has to do that. The leader has to put the energy into making those communications happen.
Right.
It can't just be simply, I'm going to call a meeting, right? As we just talked about.
Right.
There's only so many hours in the day to implore people to do so. So there's got to be better ways and newer ways to do things.
Yeah. It's exciting. We haven't thought of them yet. The canvas is pretty open.
But shame on us if we don't take these years of learning and opportunity to put that to work. Everybody go to the show notes. Just like Sarah said, we're going to put a link to the book, Steve's resources. Steve, I got to tell you, the book launched today. We hope that you are incredibly busy for the next few months, just speaking, promoting, and sharing that with the world. I would just ask that, hey, later this year, we'd love to have you back because you're now part of the Boss Hole Transformation Nation, just so you know that. You're now a member of that. But a test for our time, crisis leadership in the next normal. That's the book. Steve, this has been awesome. We just really appreciate your being with us today.
Well, John and Sarah, it's been a pleasure on this auspicious day for me and the book launch. But can I end with a quote from Mark Twain?
Please do.
Absolutely.
So the great Mark Twain once said that history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And so part of what I'd love us to see is that when we think of crisis, the word that rhymes with that is righteous, not stasis. So let's rhyme crisis with righteous, meaning we learn something from it, and we're determined to do better, and not stasis, which is we're stuck with where we are. I think
That's
we can
beautiful.
do that. We've all made the world a better place.
Amen.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
What great words to end on. Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And I guess we'll see you next time on the Boss Hole Chronicles.
We'd like to thank our guest today on the Boss Hole Chronicles. And if you have a Boss Hole Chronicles story of your own, please email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Once again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you again soon.